What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
Disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This month, we are celebrating artists who work with textiles. The first artist we are interviewing for this mini-series is Hanna Washburn, a Beacon-based artist who hand-sews sculptures out of recycled textiles. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about Hanna's dedicated studio practice, her interest in ritual, and ideas surrounding home and the human body. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I'm so honored to be here with local Hudson Valley artist Hanna Washburn. Hanna, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, of course. It's actually, I had no idea you lived right across the river.
Yeah, very close.
So fun. I find a lot of artists on Instagram and these different artist registries. So I often don't pay too much attention to where they're from, but it's funny you're right across the river. So it's lovely to have you. Listeners, I will do some screen shares over the course of the conversation if you're watching this on YouTube, so you can get a better sense of Hanna's work visually. But to start, so you work largely in textiles. So maybe to begin the conversation, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about where your interest in textiles came from.
Sure. It definitely began when I was very young in the home, as I think a lot of artists that work with textiles, that's kind of the generative seed. I grew up with a lot of family members that worked with textiles, doing a lot of whether it was repairing things or making things around the home. And I think that just kind of seeped in. And I think also textiles are something that we all have a relationship with. It's something that we wear, that we sleep in, that we're wrapped in when we're born. I think a lot of rituals involve textiles. So there's something just so familiar and comforting, and I think kind of narratively strong about them, and definitely kind of originates from this personal interest and feeling that it's been in my life for a very long time. And it wasn't until really I was in graduate school that I started to use them in my artwork, thinking about kind of merging them with other themes that I was interested in exploring. And once I started, it just made so much sense because I think it was just something that I was so connected to. And when you're exploring as a artist that's in school or still kind of figuring out your practice, I think you have these moments when you're like, oh, this is the material I should be using, or this is the theme that I should be talking about. You find something that just feels really resonant.
Yeah. I have a couple of follow-up questions there. So it seems like textiles was kind of in your life before you started thinking of yourself as an artist. Yeah. So I'm curious if you said that a number of your family members were interested in textiles. I'm curious who and what type of work they did. Was it commercial or domestic work?
It was all domestic. I grew up surrounded by really creative people that I don't think would have necessarily self-identified as artists. But my grandmother and my great-grandmother were and are, my grandmother still amazing knitters. They would make me a lot of clothing when I was young, a lot of clothing for my dolls too, which was really sweet.
Clothing for your dolls?
Yeah.
That's so sweet.
Yeah.
That's why it's so tiny.
And yeah, they were very tiny. I think, it was nice to have things that felt really special that I knew no one else would have. And just how special it felt to know the person that made it and to feel close to them. I think that was also something that resonated so much with me. And my mother also really is she does a lot of projects around the home. And I just grew up kind of just surrounded by things she would do a lot of upholstery, recovering chairs. She would find chairs at the take it or leave it at the dump and then recover them and make them beautiful. And so that was just something that felt really kind of normal, but also special. And I think, when you're learning how to do things when you're a child, you're being taught all of these different skills. And I think some resonate with you more than others. And for me, anything that involved making always felt really right. And I felt really attached to. And I just remember, yeah, like learning kind of the basic sewing skills and realizing that still like the running stitch is just such a basic building block of so many things, and you can make so many things with it. And I don't know, that I think I just that was really important.
Yeah. Yeah. One last follow-up question to that. So you said that like once you started inserting this practice of sewing into your art practice, that's when things kind of clicked. Now I'm curious because in most art schools, we have a painting department, a photo department, a sculpture department, but it's very rare. I mean, I know they do exist. Like I know in Chicago, there's a textile department, but it is super rare. And you mentioned there also that like your grandmothers, they would never consider themselves artists. So I'm wondering if your path into introducing it as a form of fine art was that, did you meet any resistance in that choice?
Yeah, I think a lot of artists that work in kind of what might be defined as traditional craft media find resistance in school or later. I think maybe that's happening less now, I hope. And I think, cover art has been around for forever, and there have been so many artists that I've been inspired by. But I do think at this moment, it does feel like there is a bit of a kind of um, it's definitely having a moment, which I
It
think
is
is
having a moment.
is great. And I think maybe I hope that those kind of distinctions are becoming less so, because I think it's just such a wonderful medium that has so much capacity for narrative richness and materiality and
Here, here.
everything.
Yeah, here, here.
I think so. When I was in undergrad, I did not go to art school. I went to a liberal arts school.
Mm.
So what really influenced me there was I was a studio art major and also an English literature major. So I think having both
Oh, the
disciplines and also
narrative.
just
Yeah.
kind of the general kind of interdisciplinary nature of the experience there really informed just the way that I think about things.
Mhm.
And then in the art department itself, we did have the distinct kind of department media-based classes, but because it was such a small school and such a small art department, you were required to take classes in like almost everything.
Mhm.
And I think that also really helped define what I was interested in and how to communicate it, because I think I had to learn, okay, this is how I communicate through printmaking. This is how I communicate through darkroom photography or
Mhm.
through painting or sculpture. And as I progressed through school, I began to kind of borrow pieces from each of those disciplines. And that's something that I think has continued. And when I went to my MFA, the program that I was in was also an interdisciplinary program. So it was not, you didn't have to adhere to a certain
Where'd you go to graduate
area.
school?
The School of Visual Arts in New York
Ah, yeah,
City.
for sure, for sure.
Yeah, so everybody was together making all different kinds of things. So I kind of was able to develop this language where I was borrowing from things I'd learned in sculpture, things I'd learned in painting class, things I'd learned in photography,
Mm.
but also things I'd learned at home and things that had kind of seeped in from just growing up as a person who loved to make things. And I think as I established, and still I'm kind of, I think it's a lifelong thing that
Hopefully
we're
it is.
all,
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah.
so. And I think it always changes. Like I feel like, I'm in this place where I'm working in a specific kind of visual language and materiality, but it still is changing and developing. There's no, I have no kind of hierarchy of like things I learned in a formal academic setting versus things that I learned at home or things that I picked up at summer camp or wherever you're learning about making or thinking. Like I think they're all equally important, at least to me in my practice. They all kind of hold equal weight. If that makes sense.
It does. It does. Yeah, I'm curious. You said something about materials, and I think that's the next question that I would like to ask you because my understanding is you don't go to like Joann's Fabrics and ask for like yards of fabric. A lot of your material is recycled material. So I'm wondering if you could chat a bit about maybe where you find your material and your significance of using found material as opposed to store-bought.
Absolutely, yeah. I would say I use largely recycled textiles. Every once in a while, if I'm working on something and I know, like, oh, I really need this specific shade of something, or I need something that's going to match this, then maybe I'll cave if I'm looking for something very particular. But for the most part, I love to work with things that are recycled because there's so much material in the world already. And I also just love the idea of taking these things that have already had a life and then bringing them together into this kind of new life, where they're alongside other materials that have led a different kind of existence. And I stitch everything by hand, and I think that very literal stitch of bringing things together, like I am the person that is kind of very literally stitching them together. That feels really powerful to me. And a lot of the materials that I use are things that came from my own life or from people that are close to me that have given me things. So whether it's clothing that I wore or towels, bed sheets, things from the home, things that belonged to people in my family. But also, as I've been working this way for several years, I've gotten more kind of, I've had a couple instances of getting significant fabric donations that have sustained me for a little while also, which has been really special.
Is it just
So
like friends and family that will give you old clothes and things like this?
pretty much, or
Wow, that's great.
as I've been working this way and shown in various places or done various residencies, I mean, maybe this is not surprising, but there are so many people that are like, I have all this vintage fabric in my basement and I'm never going to use it. Do you
Amazing.
want it? That kind
Amazing.
of thing
Yes.
happens kind of a lot.
That's
And it's
awesome.
and it's amazing. I mean, every once in a while, I mean, for the most part, you find real treasure. Sometimes you have to do a little digging, but I think a lot of people hold on to these things because they are like they hold meaning.
It must be special for them to then see your resulting sculptures with some of their fabric in it. Have you experienced that where they could go and see the second life of their clothes?
I've shared some photos. I don't know if I've definitely had that experience with like people that are close in my life,
Hmm.
where they'll be like, "Isn't that my dress?"
I love it.
Which is kind of fun.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but it's also pretty, I think the final or like, the sculptures that I make once they're out in the world, they're broken down into lots of different kind of patchworked pieces. So it's not as immediately obvious. Things maybe feel a bit transformed. I hope they are.
Hmm.
So there's these moments of recognition, but there's also a kind of a transformation that happens.
Yeah, yeah, well said. So I have a screen share up here from which exhibition was this? It's a beautiful space.
Thank you. It is a beautiful space. So
Yeah.
this was a solo show that I had very recently, in February. that was at the Olin Gallery, which is part of Washington and Jefferson College, which is right outside of Pittsburgh. Um, and it was, I think, like the largest kind of physical show that I've had. It was such a large, beautiful
Yeah, it's a
gallery.
lot of space to
Um,
fill.
yeah, and I also still somehow managed to fit it all
It looks
in
so
my
good.
car.
Oh my gosh.
Because I think also when you're an emerging artist, you have to be scrappy and you develop a lot of I my spatial reasoning skills I think have come a long way because I've had to do a lot of puzzle piecing of fitting things into
Yeah,
various spaces.
Tetris.
Exactly. And figuring out how to do these things in a way that still feels like you can do it because I often am doing these things by myself or I have my partner or a friend that's helping, but it can be a lot. But this was such a special show and it was great because it was also at the school, so I was able to interact with students
Oh,
and the
that's great.
faculty of the art department, which I
Mhm.
loved. And
Can we
it's
talk a
always,
bit? Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm wondering if we could talk a bit about the forms that I'm seeing here, because we spoke a little bit about the materials, but we haven't yet gotten to the form of these places, because these look nothing like clothes that someone once wore, as you used the word transformation, and they transformed almost into. Yeah, actually, one thing that I didn't pick up on when I was first researching your project is so some of the forms seem almost like characters, like some kind of I don't know, mix between like an animal and some otherworldly creature. But then I also see some forms that resemble things in the home, like something that looks like a non-functional chair, for example. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us maybe broadly about how you conceptualize your forms. Yeah, I'll set my question there.
totally. Yeah, that's a great question. I think also, as we were just talking about kind of distinctions between different kinds of art media and distinctions between kind of the craft world and the fine art world, and I often bristle against those things. I
Yeah.
think I also am interested in creating these forms that are not bound by any categorization.
Mm.
So they are kind of in the language of furniture or the home, in the language of creatures or plants, natural things, definitely the language of the body. There's a lot of myself in them, but they're also not only about me. So I have this impulse to want to marry all these things together and show the interconnectedness of things, also challenge the idea that something can only be one thing, that we can only be one thing, or something external could only be defined in one way. I definitely think about functionality, so taking objects that held some sort of kind of ostensible function, whether it's as covering the body or a place to sit, and then giving them their own autonomy, their own life, so that they're not kind of only existing to serve something else.
Yeah, interesting way to phrase it. So so are any of your objects like functional objects for the home? Because like the ones that look like chairs, for example, I don't know how one would sit in it.
Yeah, I mean, believe me, people do all kinds of things, people try, but the idea for me is that you can't.
That you can't.
That
That's what you said?
yeah,
Okay.
um you that this thing that maybe you have taken for granted, as we all, there are things that we don't think of as necessarily being anthropomorphic or they're serving a certain kind of purpose in our homes, but what would it mean if they bristled against that and became just something that's themselves? I think also I've always had a tendency to really anthropomorphize things in the home ever since I was a child. I think also having grown up watching certain kinds of films that focus on things like that, I'm thinking about like Beauty and the Beast, or I don't know if people are familiar with the Brave Little Toaster, which is
Yes, I am.
a lesser known title, but in it, all the kitchen appliances come to life and have distinct personalities. I was very affected by the Brave Little Toaster as a child, and I glued googly eyes onto all of the kitchen appliances at my parents' house. I think I always just had a tendency to like think of these things as alive. So there's definitely also an element of childhood and nostalgia, both personally, but also maybe something that sparks that for others as well.
Yeah, I'm curious about because you said that you hand stitch all of these, and listeners, if you're watching this on YouTube, you could see that they're wildly elaborate. Can you talk a little bit about your process? I guess I'm specifically curious if like you have a form in mind and then you try to execute it, or does it kind of happen organically?
It's more the latter.
Okay.
I will usually have some sort of vague plan. I'll do some drawings, or I'll have an idea of like, oh, I want this to occupy this certain kind of space. I want it to be standing, or I want it to be leaning or hanging or whatever it is. But it almost always changes. And I think that if I had a more specific plan, I would find myself getting frustrated because I wouldn't be able to execute it the way that I had intended.
Mm.
I try to leave it very open because then it just can kind of lead me where it wants to go. And I also find that that's exciting. I like the idea that I don't really know what's going to happen, where it's going to go, what I might make. I do in the early parts of making a work, I will use a sewing machine for kind of big piecing, because to just get the form basically, it's hard to envision it until you have a very basic shape. But I always go back over everything by hand because it's such an additive process that initial shape often ends up being like completely covered anyway.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of adding and adding and adding and some subtracting, but mostly adding. And I like the directness of stitching because you can just my studio is as you can probably imagine a bit of a mess. It's full of materials, and I like to just feel surrounded by them so I can grab things because you never know what is going to feel right.
Mm.
And I'm also interested in like clashing. I think sometimes, I'm making something that feels harmonious in terms of color palette, but other times I I like to think about what it means for things to clash and then to bring them together and just kind of encourage them to live together.
Yeah, that's kind of the way that you described these like different forms kind of coexisting in one space and not trying
Mm.
to categorize them all under one name or one theme. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
curious. You mentioned something kind of in passing about ritual. Was that in
Mm.
regards to your process of making or in regards to the forms of your objects?
I think that I don't know if everyone would necessarily use that word ritual, but I think that anybody that has a creative practice, there is an element of, at least my practice involves a lot of kind of setting up rules and then breaking them,
Mm.
or setting up rules and following them. There's this compulsion, I think, that a lot of people have, whether it's a creative one or you're making something in a different kind of capacity, but this need to kind of get something out there. And I definitely have that. And I sometimes think, okay, what I, if someone asks me kind of what is I don't know, maybe somebody also that's a little bit outside of the arts would ask like, what is the end game kind of? What is the goal? And I definitely have goals that I set for myself
Yeah,
in my
what
practice.
would you say to that, or what do you say to that if when asked?
Exactly. I don't really believe in that, I think. I'm still kind of
Here.
figuring, I think a lot of what I've realized is that there isn't a lot of finality in this practice. You know, I've definitely set goals for myself that I've achieved, and I feel proud of myself for them. I have goals that I'd like to achieve, whether it's, you know, a certain kind of project or a certain kind of opportunity I'd like to have someday. Those are definitely there, but I think even if I never had another show or never had any sort of press or anything, I would probably just still be doing this. I guess that's what I mean by ritual. It's so meaningful to share it with the world. It means so much to have these chances to speak about it and to share it. But it also has just become this thing that is just so integral to my life that I would probably just keep on doing it. And
Oh, I
it's
love that.
kind of like, it almost feels like silly, not silly, but it's funny to say it out loud because it's like, there aren't a lot of things that are like that for me, but it's just, I have this, yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a ritual of
And let's try to,
that.
so
Yeah.
ritual defined as process, or defined as just the creative act and not worrying about an object per se or an outcome? Like, how would we define
Yeah, I guess
ritual
it's
as well?
kind of both. I
Hmm.
think it's maybe most literally the need to get into the studio. And even, you know, sometimes I have a piece that I'm working on that needs to be finished by a certain deadline, or a studio visit that's happening that I want to make sure I'm prepared for. But a lot of the time, there isn't something like that, but I still feel like, oh, I have to get into the
Mm.
studio just for me. And I think that is something when you're in school, it's so much more regulated. You know, you have your classes, you have crits, you have studio visits with your teachers and your peers.
And
So there's a
deadlines,
lot of
yeah. Yeah, a
there's
lot
a
of
lot of
deadlines.
deadlines,
Yeah.
there's, you know, curriculum, there's the semesters. And then when you graduate, you're kind of like, oh, now I'm just out here.
Hmm.
And I, you know, you can set up some of those things for yourself, but I think ultimately it has become for me like this need to, I just have so many ideas that I'm trying to form to get out there somehow. And even if even if I'm the only one that sees them, or like my husband and my mom are the only ones that see them, like that's okay. I hope more people see them, and that there's something in it for others, but there is something that's, I don't know. Does that
Do you
make
set
sense?
rules? It does. It does. And it's beautiful. And it's so nice to hear because it's so hard for many. And a lot of our listeners are in like the graduate school or recently
Mm,
post school point in their career. And it's so nice to hear that you're so passionate about making without the worry or fear that you might show or not. And my inclination is that work that's made under those quote unquote guidelines is going to be a lot more successful because you're just making it right from the heart and you're making it from a need for yourself as opposed to a need to impress,
mm.
right?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely also have, I mean, I don't want to sound like I've totally figured it all out. I definitely have those worries too, but I think
Yeah.
that there is, I've come to realize that it is something that comes from it sounds cheesy, but it like comes from inside. It comes
Yeah.
from myself. And I think that's something that took a little while, you know, after I graduated from undergrad, had a period where I took a little break from making, and same with grad school. There was like, you know, a period where I was kind of like, what am I doing? But when you don't have those external forces that are kind of like, you have to make this thing because you're going to get a grade, or you have to graduate, or whatever it is, you have to find it for yourself.
And I'm curious, how did you like? Do you have a like I have? I'm a planner person. Like, do you write studio days down? Like, how do you ensure that you get yourself to the studio without deadlines?
Yeah, I I have a planner also, and I do have a full-time day job. So that does, in some ways it makes it harder. I see my cat is about to make an appearance. It's Jonas.
Hi,
In some
Jonas.
ways, um, having less time makes it harder. But in other ways, I find that when I'm busier, I'm better at organizing
It's so
my
true.
time.
It's so
Yeah,
true. It's so true.
yeah. I've gone through phases where I've had kind of more part-time work, and then my schedule is a little bit more erratic, but maybe is a little bit freer in some ways. But for the past couple of years, have had a 9 to 5 job, and that has actually been really helpful for me. I think everybody has to figure out what works for them.
Balance, yeah.
But I think it has helped me stay kind of pretty scheduled. I don't have a ton of time for other things, but that's the way of it. But I think another thing that has really helped me is that my studio is in our detached garage behind my house. So I had it converted. And I did some of the converting myself with much help from a contractor. So what is nice about that is it's a separate space and I know it's there, but even if I only have an hour,
Just
that's
walk
I don't have
outside.
a commute. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't have to worry about those elements of having a studio that's elsewhere, which also, I mean, I do sometimes miss having a community of artists. I think that's one of the things that I miss the most about being in school and also having a studio that's surrounded by other people.
Mhm.
But for the most part, this has just been a nice setup for me because even, yeah, if I get home from work and I only have an hour or 2 hours, I can still use that time. And even if it's not like the most productive time, it still feels good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Love it. Love it. I guess I'll have one last question for you. Do you have any upcoming shows or anything that you would like to promote on here?
Yeah, I'm currently in this really wonderful group show at Susan Ely Gallery in Hudson. That's closing fairly soon. That's closing this Sunday, which is May 12th. So may not be open anymore, but there's a talk on Susan Ely's Instagram that is all of the artists in the show, and they're all Hudson Valley, largely Hudson Valley based fiber artists, except for one artist that is
Oh,
based in Greece. But it's a really wonderful group of people, and we had a really nice conversation just about both being artists that work with textiles, but also just kind of our general art practices.
that's great. So
Um,
listeners, I'll include a link to that talk on our website, artuncoveredpodcast.com. Okay, and continue. You have anything else coming up?
yeah, I currently have a solo show that is up through June 9th at the Delaware Valley Arts Alliance, which is in Narrowsburg, a little over an hour west of
Yeah, in the
where I live in.
Catskills, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's such a lovely town. I'd never really spent time there before, but it's been great to get to know the community there.
You have a cool antique place there.
Yes, that's definitely the vibe. And
Yeah.
it's such a great, the opening was last weekend, and I don't really know anybody there other than the people I was working with at the gallery. And it was so well attended. There's just
Oh,
such a
that's great.
community of people that really come out for those things, which I
Lovely.
so appreciated. So I have that show is up um, through June 9th. And then I'll be taking a little bit of a break because I'm expecting my first child in July.
Oh my gosh,
So things will
congratulations.
probably be on pause for a little bit, but
Yeah.
I do have a two-person exhibition in October that's actually with another fiber-based artist and a friend of mine who was in the show at Susan Ely as well. Her name's Anna Maria Farina. We will have a two-person show at the Hillier Gallery in Washington, D.C. So that's a little bit on the horizon, but something I'm looking forward to. And yeah, hopefully more things to come.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Great, great. Yeah, listeners, so I'll include links to all of those dates and exhibitions, and of course, a link to Hannah's website so you could follow her work there, Instagram, all the things. Hannah, thank you again so much for chatting with us. It was an honor.
Oh, thank you. It was so nice to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week for part 2 of our 3-part series on fiber artists. We will be speaking with artist Poppy Delta Dawn. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.